And welcome to FISM News. I'm Samuel Case.
And I'm Renata Kiss.
And tonight, severe storms wreak havoc over Memorial Day weekend.
Meanwhile, an Israeli strike kills dozens in Rafah.
And Iran continues to build up its uranium supply. Well, as I just hinted, severe thunderstorms and tornadoes caused massive damage this Memorial Day weekend. At least 21 people were killed across Arkansas, Kentucky, Texas, and Oklahoma. Hundreds of buildings were destroyed over the three-day weekend, and hundreds of thousands of people were left without power. President Biden has since activated FEMA to assess the damage and provide support on the ground. Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear, he declared a state of emergency early yesterday morning, with storms impacting almost the entire state of Kentucky.
Communities across Kentucky experienced storms that produced strong winds, multiple tornadoes, hail in some places. The storm knocked out power for thousands of Kentuckians, temporarily shut down numerous roads and interstates, and caused massive damage to homes and businesses. Sadly, we can confirm that we have lost at least 4 Kentuckians from last night's storm.
Later in the day, a severe thunderstorm watch was issued for parts of New Jersey, New York, and Pennsylvania as that storm was expected to move eastward. This comes just a couple days after a powerful tornado also killed 4 people in Iowa as well.
And speaking of those storms, over 6,000 flights were delayed yesterday, while almost 500 were canceled. Almost all of these setbacks happened on the East Coast. Those delays came on one of the biggest travel weekends on record. Well, on Friday, the TSA announced they screened almost 3 million people, a record-breaking amount for single-day travelers. This aligned with AAA's prediction that roughly 3.5 million travelers would fly over the weekend. And the auto company also predicted that roughly 38 million people would drive to their destinations. The number of drivers were up 4% from last year. Meanwhile, air travel increased about 5% from the past year as well. All of these numbers set a record high not seen in the past 20 years.
Now, Renata, correct me if I'm wrong, I believe both of us did sort of a staycation for Memorial Day weekend, and based on these numbers, I think we're both glad that we did.
Yes, absolutely.
Don't want to have to deal with that. Meanwhile, speaking of the weekend events, President Biden spoke at Arlington National Cemetery yesterday, honoring America's fallen soldiers after placing a wreath at the tomb of the unknown soldier. Here's the president.
We gather at this sacred place at this solemn moment to remember, to honor the sacrifice of the hundreds of thousands of women and men who've given their lives to this nation, each one bound by common commitment, not to a place, not to a person, not to a president, but to an idea, unlike any idea in human history, the idea of the United States of America.
Meanwhile, former President Donald Trump honored the fallen in a Truth Social post, saying, quote, "We can never replace them, we can never repay them, but we can always remember. Today, that is what we're doing. We remember." Now, Trump then later faced criticism over a separate Memorial Day post where he said this, quote, "Happy Memorial Day to all, including the human scum that is working so hard to destroy our once great country." In that post, Trump then went on to complain about his various legal issues.
And on Sunday, the Libertarian Party rejected the efforts of former President Donald Trump and independent candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. as their nominee for president. Both Trump and Kennedy spoke at the party's national convention in Washington, D.C. in an attempt to sway the delegates.
A lot of people ask why I came to speak at this Libertarian convention, and you know, it's an interesting question, isn't it? Well, in the last year, I've been indicted by the government on 91 different things, so if I wasn't a libertarian before, I sure as hell am a libertarian now.
Liberal-leaning candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. leaned on the Bill of Rights as common ground with the Libertarian Party.
Our public officials have forgotten that vision for America, and it's time that we remind them. We can only do that by electing leaders who understand the necessity for personal sacrifices to preserve the Bill of Rights. That's the path to restoring our national greatness. That will be my promise to you as President of the United States.
Both candidates received a mixed reception from Libertarian delegates, with some in the crowd even booing the former president. Despite attempts to win over the convention, both Trump and Kennedy were rejected by Libertarian Party officials. Instead, voters selected former Georgia Senate candidate Chase Oliver. A former Democrat, Oliver describes himself as openly gay and in favor of policies such as an open border. In his acceptance speech, he criticized Israel for the ongoing war in Gaza and promised to serve as a contrast to both former President Trump and President Biden.
And before we go to break here, with school out for the summer now, anti-Israel protesters are now moving their demonstrations off campus. Protesters have begun to move their activism onto city properties, potentially signaling a new trend for the summer. For example, protesters from Drexel University set up an encampment last week in West Philadelphia's Clark Park. Meanwhile, in California, workers at UC Santa Cruz, they voted to strike in reaction to what they believed were free speech violations against anti-Israel protests on their campus. Meanwhile, other protests have also taken place in New York City, Los Angeles, and even outside of President Biden's home in Wilmington, Delaware. All right, and we'll dive into international news up next. We'll be right back after this short break.
There are moments in life that define us. Choices determine the courses we take. Choices that create life, or those that save a life. And some make life worthwhile. There are decisions to stay or to go, to remain the same or to grow. Sometimes we pray and make peace. Other times we take a stand for what we believe. In celebration, mourning, triumph, and defeat, we are invested in every decision we seek. Despite differences, we have one thing in common: the desire to do all for the glory of God. Keep your wallet aligned with your heart and your investments in harmony with your faith. Timothy Plan, biblically responsible mutual funds, ETFs, and retirement plans. Before investing, carefully consider a fund's investment objective, risks, charges, and expenses contained in the prospectus available at timothyplan.com. Read carefully before investing.
On January 21st, 1824, a baby boy was born in Clarksburg, Virginia. His name was Thomas Jackson. And during the American Civil War, he would become the second most famous general of the Confederate Army after General Robert E. Lee. Most people do not recognize him by his given name, but many do know him by his legendary nickname, Stonewall Jackson.
To watch more episodes of A Moment in History, go to FISM.tv.
Tragically, and all too often, a young mother in an unplanned pregnancy is in crisis. You can be there for her by giving a life-changing ultrasound through Preborn. Seeing her baby on ultrasound is a game changer, doubling the chances she will choose life from 40% to 80%. For only $28 a month, less than $1 a day, you can show a mom her baby on ultrasound.
And welcome back to FISM News. I'm Renata Kiss. Well, let's get right into coverage on that tragic IDF strike in Rafah. FISM's Ian Patrick has the details for us.
As the war against Hamas continues to rage on, a recent attack from Israel's military has been labeled as a tragic mistake by its own government. That admission was from Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in response to an airstrike within the embattled city of Rafah. Shortly after Hamas claimed it fired rockets towards Israel from Gaza, the IDF issued airstrikes on suspected Hamas targets, and this was on Sunday. Now, while the IDF did say the strikes eliminated 2 senior Hamas commanders, reports also showed that it accidentally struck a civilian camp and killed 45 civilians. Speaking to Israeli parliament after the fact, Netanyahu said the intent was obviously not to harm any civilians in the attack.
In Rafah, we already evacuated about 1 million non-combatant residents, and despite our utmost effort not to harm non-combatants, something unfortunately went tragically wrong. We are investigating the incident and will reach conclusions because this is our policy.
But since Israel's admission, the world has increasingly criticized the nation. A slew of international communities condemned the attack shortly after reports confirmed the casualties. Among this group was South Africa, which recently accused Israel of genocide before the International Court of Justice. That accusation was mostly agreed upon by the court, which recently ordered Israel to end its military actions in Rafah. That, however, cannot be enforced by the court itself. The world has mostly been waiting on a reaction from the United States, however, which has so far expressed support for Israel's campaign to eradicate Hamas. The Biden administration has repeatedly called for Israel to show care when operating around civilians. And the U.S. even threatened to withhold aid should Israel cross any predetermined red lines in its Rafah offensive. This recent strike is currently being investigated by Biden officials to determine if this would actually count as crossing any of those red lines, and a decision will be made sometime afterward. For its part, Israel and the military continue to say that the strike was carefully planned beforehand in order to reduce the risk of civilian casualty. The IDF said in a statement that it conducted, quote, aerial surveillance and even deployed precise munitions as part of this effort. It also worked on unknown additional intelligence to hone in their precision strike. In related news, the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry said that a more recent Israeli strike resulted in the deaths of 21 other civilians on Tuesday. However, it should be noted the IDF said it was not aware of this incident, and it actually has yet to be corroborated by other sources as of this moment. For now, we will continue to monitor for updates on the current operation within Rafah. This is Ian Patrick reporting for FISM News.
Thanks so much for bringing us that important update, Ian. Meanwhile, Houthi rebels in Yemen freed over 100 prisoners on Sunday in what the terror group called a humanitarian initiative. They say most of those released were the sick, the wounded, and the elderly. The Houthis also claim those prisoners were soldiers for Yemen's government they had captured in battle. Yemen says that's not actually true, though, saying they were not soldiers, but rather kidnapped civilians. Yemen's deputy minister for human rights said, quote, releasing these victims under any name does not absolve the Houthi of this crime. Yemen has been in a civil war between the Houthis and its internationally recognized government since 2014, and it's believed thousands of people are still being held as prisoners since that war first began.
Meanwhile, Iran is getting dangerously close to having nuclear weapons. According to a UN watchdog report seen by the Associated Press, the country has amassed a stockpile of 60% enriched uranium just in the past few months. The Foundation for the Defense of Democracy says that 99% of building weapons-grade uranium happens in the enrichment phase of 60%. The last phase, which takes uranium to 90% of enrichment, is only 1% away from reaching weapons-grade level. That last period, known as the breakout time, only takes 7 days. The Daily Wire reports that Iran has been stockpiling uranium since Biden took office in 2020, and because of his lax sanctions, the country has been making great advances in this territory.
Meanwhile, more disturbing news. A massive landslide buried thousands of people in Papua New Guinea over the weekend. Rescue efforts have been slow moving due to highway damage as well as tribal warfare in the area. According to the United Nations, the first excavator arrived just on Sunday. That's nearly 48 hours after the initial landslide on Friday. 6 villages in total are in the disaster zone, and authorities say that some homes are completely buried below 20 feet of debris. The government says around 2,000 people could be trapped underneath.
Tragic indeed. Meanwhile, Putin signals willingness for a ceasefire with Ukraine. This comes as Putin incorporated 4 Ukrainian regions into Russia in 2022, though the country never gained full control of any of them. Reuters reports that the ceasefire deal would fall short of Russia's expectations, and it would certainly not work while Ukrainian President Zelensky was in power. At the same time, the U.S. still holds the view that a peace negotiation must include Russia's respect for Ukraine's internationally recognized borders. The U.S. State Department does not believe the Kremlin is seriously interested in ending the war, while Ukraine says that Russia cannot be trusted with any deal. According to Russian sources, locking in the Ukrainian territories would essentially mean a Russian victory and a successful defeat of NATO's perceived aggression on the country's sovereignty.
And while on the topic of Russia, a group of 6 NATO allies now plan to build a so-called drone wall from Norway all the way to Poland in order to defend against Russian attacks and smuggling. Ministers from Finland, Norway, Poland, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania met to discuss that plan over the weekend. Few details are actually known at this time, but Lithuania has suggested that the project could be funded by the EU. Russia has been making provocative moves in the Baltic region in the recent weeks. Russia recently proposed new maritime borders in the Baltic Sea, for example, while also removing border buoys on a river separating Russia from Estonia in a move the EU decried as unacceptable at the time. And we have plenty more news coming up in religion, culture, and more. But first, let's go back in time with Seth Udinsky for today's A Moment in History.
Welcome back to A Moment in History. I'm Seth Udinsky. Well, in this episode, we travel back more than 500 years to the crucial time period in church history known as the Protestant Reformation. Now, when we study history, we have to remember a good question to often ask is why? Why did this thing happen? Why did this person ascend to the throne? How did this political movement begin, etc.? Context is key when we study history, and that is what we will study in this episode as we explore the tumultuous, violent, and often immoral world of Christian Europe in the decades leading up to the Reformation. Let's look at the foundations of the Protestant Reformation, or more specifically, the need for a Reformation in Europe. So in the years leading up to the Reformation's beginning in October of 1517, Christian Europe was often and unfortunately anything but Christian. For 1,000 years, the Catholic Church had been the dominant power in Europe, but for the last 2 centuries of the Middle Ages, the 14th and 15th centuries, the Church fell into deep decay. Now, you have to understand, it was not necessarily a decline in power, although the defeat in the Crusades and the rising Muslim force in the Ottoman Empire, as well as the Black Death, weren't really doing the Church any favors. It wasn't that as much, though, as it was a decline in morality. Popes and bishops and archbishops, men who were supposed to be the leaders of the church and shepherd the flock of God, became much more known for their lavish and licentious living than for their ability to faithfully shepherd God's people. For example, Pope Leo X, who reigned over the church at the dawn of the Reformation in the early 16th century and publicly feuded with Martin Luther, once said during his reign on Peter's throne this: "Since God has given us the papacy, let us enjoy it." Well, enjoy it he did, and many others like him, as popes were well known to live like kings and have mistresses and even concubines. There was also a decline in order in the Catholic Church as infighting caused a schism in the 14th and early 15th century that became known as the Babylonian captivity of the papacy. We don't have time for a deep dive into that, but basically multiple popes and anti-popes reigned and battled with each other in various European cities for a century until things finally quieted down with the Council of Constance in 1415. Of course, in 1415, we also see another foreshadowing of the Reformation, the death of John Huss, the Bohemian theologian who was burned at the stake by the church. His crime? Criticizing the church for its failure to teach common folk to read the Bible and for its sale of indulgences. And the indulgence sales, with all due respect to each of those other things I just mentioned, was really the main catalyst that forced Martin Luther to nail his 95 Theses to the Wittenberg church door in 1517. Now, the church taught erroneously that sinners could purchase their way into heaven, or at least purchase years and centuries off their time in purgatory, which is another false doctrine, with these indulgences. They were sort of known as contracts. The church made a pretty penny off of these, by the way, and used the funds to build the lavish new St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. It was a dark time indeed, but the light of the gospel would shine again, thanks to the faithfulness of the Protestant reformers, and really it was the faithfulness of God working through his people to spread the good news to a world that, much like today, desperately needed it. Thanks so much for joining me once again for A Moment in History.
Many mothers find strength in the experience of giving birth as they overcome physical challenges and embrace the journey of bringing a new life into the world. You can help an abortion-minded mother receive discipleship, encouragement, and the strength needed to have her baby. During the month of May, you can bless your mom for Mother's Day by giving to Preborn on your mother's behalf. Go to preborn.com/FISM to give. That's preborn.com/FISM.
When it comes to money, I always have so many questions. I never know where to go to get answers to those questions. They never really teach you this stuff in school, like some of the best ways to handle it, how to save, when to invest, where to invest, even just what to do with the money. And if I put it in the stock market, what's the best way to protect from losing it all? That fear can be paralyzing. You don't really know what decisions to make. As a Christian, I don't want to give my money to people who are going to use it for things that God hates. When I discovered financial issues, it was like a burden was lifted off my shoulders. Not only did I gain access to a simple investment strategy that I can manage myself, I also have the peace of mind that my money will not be going to companies that actively promote things that God hates. Financial issues has allowed me to experience peace in my investments.
Invest your money in a God-honoring way. Go to financialissues.org.
When a woman experiences an unplanned pregnancy, she's faced with a difficult decision. Preborn connects with life-affirming pregnancy clinics across the nation and provides them with free ultrasound sessions for expectant mothers. When a mother sees her baby on an ultrasound and hears their heartbeat, it doubles the chance she'll choose life. Visit preborn.com/life to save a baby's life.
And welcome back once again to FISM News. Well, let's begin with some coverage regarding the border crisis. First and foremost, Customs and Border Protection have recently discovered a new method for trafficking fentanyl into the U.S. A report from this weekend showed that authorities at a border point in Arizona found 700,000 fentanyl pills hidden within food cans. The discovery was made on May 16th during what was a routine inspection at the time. According to details later released, the pills were wrapped in transparent plastic bags and hidden inside grocery items. Agents were able to find the drugs due to small anomalies in these supermarket items. For example, one agent noticed an unusual sound when shaking one of the cans, leading to the discovery of this fentanyl trafficking operation.
Truly shocking, 700,000 pills. Wow. Meanwhile, California, they must pay back millions of dollars to the federal government after wrongfully claiming Medicaid services for illegal immigrants. A federal health department watchdog says the state wrongfully claimed over $52 million for non-emergency medical care for illegals in 2018 and 2019. According to the state, that came from an error in the state's formula for calculating these things. The auditor says they underestimated money spent on non-emergency claims by roughly 8%. According to federal estimates, though, nearly 50% of all Medicaid claims by California illegal immigrants are non-emergency. The state will now have to pay that money back.
Meanwhile, the Uvalde victims' families are now suing Meta, the video game company Activision, and the gun manufacturing company that allegedly led to the mass shooting. Prosecuting attorney Josh Koskoff says there is a direct correlation between the mass shooter's actions at Robb Elementary School and the resources that the man used. These included Call of Duty, the video game owned by Activision, Instagram, and the gun manufacturer Daniel Defense. Koskoff says that this three-headed monster knowingly exposed him to the weapon, conditioned him to see it as a tool to solve his problems, and trained him to use it. Earlier, Koskoff explained why mass shootings in the U.S. are an issue.
Mass shootings are a very destructive thing. They destroy families, they destroy communities, they divide communities, they pit people against each other.
None of the companies responded to the lawsuit as of this reporting. Meanwhile, the families of the victims have already received a $2 million settlement from the city for the law enforcement's slow response on the day of the tragedy.
And speaking of tragedy, a Missouri lawmaker is asking for prayer after announcing that a gang killed his daughter and son-in-law who ran an orphanage in Haiti. Their names are Davy and Natalie Lloyd. The young Christian couple stayed in their roles at the orphanage despite the escalating violence in Haiti. They were tragically killed in a gang shootout last Thursday. Missouri State Rep Ben Baker announced their deaths on Friday, saying the couples were defined by their love for the Haitian people. The story quickly gained national attention, with former President Donald Trump personally offering his condolences to the family.
I also want to pay our deepest respects to the two young missionaries from Missouri, Davy and Natalie Lloyd, that were viciously killed yesterday in Haiti. It was a horrible thing, and I just want to pay our respects to their families. They're great families, incredible people, and it's a very, very sad moment. What happened was so horrible.
Truly sad indeed, and we'll be praying for them as well. Meanwhile, a U.S. appeals court ruled recently that state healthcare companies must provide transgender services to patients. The ruling came based on two lower court cases that said both North Carolina and West Virginia's Medicaid programs discriminated against patients who were seeking transgender surgeries. Virginia-based Fourth Circuit Judge Roger Gregory, a Bill Clinton appointee, ruled that refusing to perform medically necessary treatments for these patients was obviously discriminatory in his words. The judge equated cancer patients getting a mastectomy with those who suffer from gender dysphoria and want their breasts removed. He argued that if cancer patients can receive these treatments, transgender people should too. Both North Carolina and West Virginia said they would fight to preserve their Medicaid programs. West Virginia is planning to appeal to the Supreme Court.
And I can certainly see that being something the High Court takes up in the near future. And finally, as always, we do like to try to end on an encouraging note here on FISM News. And since we're coming off of Memorial Day weekend, we thought we'd take a look at the incredible work of one ministry that they're sharing the love of Christ with our service men and women. Ton Tavern Fellowship is the name of this ministry. It's a Christian nonprofit dedicated to discipleship, specifically in the Marine Corps, believing that Christianity already shares so much in common with Marine values.
The Marine Corps culture is one of service. One of the things that really attracted me to the Marine Corps, in fact, were the fact that Marine Corps leadership and values really are hand in hand with the biblical model of leadership and kind of the biblical character that God gives us through Jesus.
That was Lieutenant Colonel John Dalby. He serves on the ministry's board of directors. It's interesting to note that almost 70% of military members, they claim to be Christian, but of course, living out the faith, that's not nearly as common. Ton Tavern aims to strengthen their faith through Bible studies around the world, and many Marines say the lessons have been a great help, especially on the battlefield.
Service members in general, and Marines in particular, do have a unique need because you're faced with the reality that your life could be on the line at any given time.
You can learn about their work at tontavernfellowship.org. That's TUN, tavernfellowship.org. It really is incredible work they're doing. And he's absolutely right. I can see how having that ingrained faith can be an incredible comfort and encouragement while you're out there risking your life for the country that you love. I'm sure that really adds to security as well as acts of heroism you need to perform out on the battlefield.
Absolutely, and I'm just encouraged that there are people who not only care for veterans or not only care for people in the military from a physical perspective, but they also care for them a spiritual perspective, which of course ultimately is what really matters.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. All right, well, that's our program for today. Thank you so much for joining us, and please visit FISMnews.tv for more content.
And as always, you can check us out on social media as well. We'll see you tomorrow with more news coverage.